So, welcome everybody to our third Chiron seminar of this year. So, the previous two we were talking about kind of more recent contemporary issue, and now we're moving back in time where it all started. Um, when did we start having our interesting relations with horses? And our speaker today is William Taylor. So, probably needs no introduction. I hope you have read his most recent book. If you haven't, then you should do it. And he is going to tell us what archaeology can say about horses at the time when there were no written records. A couple of household notices as usual. If you want to keep your cameras on, you can. You have like proper background and everything. Please mute your microphones for the duration of the lecture. And if you have questions, we can answer them either at the end or you can put them in the chat. And we will also answer them at the end. But kind of, if you have immediate questions, you're welcome to do it already now. So the floor is to William.
All right, thank you so much, Anastasia. And I'm gonna try to share my screen here. So maybe give me a thumbs up if everything looks okay. Can you see that, Anastasia?
Uh, yes, everything is fine.
Okay. Well, thank you so much f for the invitation to be here. And I'm really excited to talk with you all today about horse domestication. I'm just looking through the participants list, and I can see that some of the great thinkers in horse archaeology are here in the audience. So I hope I will do it justice. And I also see some old friends in here. Hi, Eve. I haven't seen you in ages. Hope you're good. And looking forward to the chance to talk more with such a scholarly audience. Maybe we can have some useful Q&A and such. Is it true that we have about an hour and a half? I mean, should I go about 45 minutes here and then Q&A? Is that or
We don't have a time limit, so as long as
okay.
people can talk, and I think we can talk for hours, like our last
All
lecture
right. Well,
was
if
long.
I talk more than an hour, everyone's gonna fall asleep. So I'll try to keep it use enough of our time here for engagement with you all. And what without further ado, let's let's go ahead and begin. So with this group, I don't really have to talk about, just how transformative and important the domestication of the horse was in terms of our daily life, right? The very journal itself and the group of folks that we are sitting here with are sort of united here by our shared understanding and appreciation of that fact, the way that horses transformed the ancient world, the way that horses continue to sort of be a core part of our lives today, all around the world. Um, whether we're talking about, Europe, where a lot of folks here are based, or Asia, or the Americas, or almost any major landmass, around the world where there's grass, there's usually horses. And so for, since the beginning of um, academic and especially archaeological inquiry into our human horse past, folks have been, I think, quite rightly so concerned with, focused on, and curious about understanding how and why we got to the relationship that we have with horses today, which is quite different from, the way things would have been 100,000 years ago, right? And we'll talk more about that. But what we call domestication, clearly horses, our connection with people has changed a lot. And there's a lot of interest from the beginning of my discipline in archaeology. Folks have been, I think, attempting to understand when, why, and how this sort of transformative change occurred, and what the implications of that might be. There's been a variety of different models and configurations for understanding horse domestication, and I'm not going to even attempt to summarize what all those might be. I'm just going to highlight on a couple of models that have approached something like status quo or predominance over, the last X number of decades, right? One of the most, influential configurations of this sometimes would be called like the Kurgan hypothesis, right? Um, from a very early point, folks have understood a connection between horses and the Eurasian steppes, and in particular have focused on kind of the boundary between Europe and Asia as a place where um, a number of obvious kind of cultural transformations appear to have happened in the past. The sort of titular kurgans here are something many of you may be familiar with, large mounded burials that in later prehistory are quite clearly associated and prominent with a lot of horse cultures of Inner Asia. There's evidence of migrations from this region into places like Central and Northern Europe, into places like uh, Central and Eastern Asia, even. And of course, this region is also connected with language families and um, uh, cultures that we later on associate with a kind of a wider range of impact in early horse cultures across Eurasia. You might hear the terms Indo-European or Indo-Iranian languages, right? And so this kind of package of assumptions and timing has been quite popular for many, many years as a potential, source for at least the how or at least the why or the where and the when, if not the why and the how of horse domestication. As archaeology has kind of grown into having ways that we can really um, build a scientific framework for some of these models, um, the Kurgan hypothesis and some of its kind of archaeological correlates, the Yamnaya culture, have sort of waxed and waned in terms of their whether they're taking forefront in these kind of public narratives around domestication. There was a point in the 90s where, one or two quite influential archaeological components in what is today Ukraine sort of jumped forward as seeming to provide the kind of evidentiary footing for this. And other points, the sort of balloon has popped a little bit at some of those sites, like one known as Terievka. Um, More recently, kind of the predominant understanding of horse domestication has focused on I would say, a slight modification or variant of the kind of Kurgan hypothesis, which growing as archaeological tools for tracking things like transport, as biomolecular tools for tracing things like um, secondary products, milk, and these kind of things started to really grow and mature. Um, the kind of evidentiary footing settled um, pretty conclusively on a site known as Botai or a cultural horizon known as Botai, kind of growing out of northern Kazakhstan. And while the cultural connections here are not exactly identical to the Kurgan hypothesis, the rough timing of some of these cultural horizons at Botai in northern Kazakhstan sort of align with this um, the parameters of this model, which would place key developments in, say, the fourth millennium BC. And, there is quite a lot of archaeological record to work with, unlike some of the period of interest here in areas, north of the Black and Caspian Sea. Um, the Botai culture is like 100% horses and not every site, of course, but really a shocking amount of horse remains at archaeological sites. And so there's a lot of, it's quite a logical place to start for looking at building, you know, if you're looking for like an archaeological visible launch pad for the human connection with the horse, a place that's kind of near, the Western steppes area that had been long looked at as a kind of Indo-European homeland, a place with such an extraordinary quantity of horse remains, seemed like a logical place to start. And so I would say when I was coming up in graduate school, up until very recently, it's almost taken as unassailable fact that horses were domesticated at Botay. Um, within the last 10 years, though, our techniques and toolkits for understanding the past and building evidentiary-based models for it have sort of exploded and in fact sort of given us more data and more information than we really know what to do with. And in the process, I think have sort of destabilized um, our sense of consensus around when and how horses were first domesticated. Um, the sort of um, pin that might have burst the balloon here was this paper circa 2018, I think, on Gaunitz et al., in which they attempted to sequence the genome of all of a large number of horse remains from the side of Botai, sort of with the understanding that we'd be exploring, how the horses we have today first connected back to this obvious launchpad for horse domestication. And in the process of developing kind of ancient genomic sequences for these horses, they came to a sort of a stunning conclusion, which is that not a single one of these Botai horses are actually the ancestor of the horses that we have today. In fact, they are all identifiable as what we would call today as Przewalski's horse, or I guess I can never quite understand. I hear sometimes people say Przewalski. My Americanness, I'm just going to butcher things, and so apologies if I've mispronounced your favorite method there. Um, Przewalski's horse is a horse that is still alive today. Um, it nearly went extinct in the 20th century, kind of an aggressive conservation and introduction effort has put it back into a number of preserves in Europe and Asia. Um, and in fact, there's one in the horse rescue just down the road from me here in Colorado. So they're doing okay today, but they're certainly, you would probably most recognize them, right, from their similarities to images that we would find in Paleolithic rock art, right? They're characterized by their kind of spiky mane and beautiful kind of dun color with the white bellies. Really quite extraordinary animals. Um, this I think was quite a shocking finding. And in as put forward by the genomics team that made the discovery, one interpretation of this might be like, oh my gosh, wow, we now have two separate domestications of the horse. And I think, for many folks, this is still where they would land on this issue. But I would encourage you, if you take a moment to come look at the Gaunitz et al. Paper in Science, um, science provides the opportunity, and it's not a simple opportunity for folks, to comment on a new publication in an academic sense. It's, these things get kind of peer reviewed. It's a fair amount of work to put them together. If you go back and scroll down to the bottom of that page, you can see that there are at least seven paper, many of which are quite befuddled or angry or confused about sort of what all of this means for our understanding of horse domestication, what it might imply for the conservation prospects of these contemporary species. And I think it just kind of illustrates the horse world is kind of rattled by this issue and now sort of left with my sort of cheeky little hook for this topic, trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what do we make of the state of knowledge on horse domestication and is there a coherent narrative that we can put together here? Um, I'm probably not going to solve all those questions for you, but I am going to give you my own sort of hot take answers, and I think maybe nudge us forward towards some answers and some ideas, some new directions by the end of the talk here. But before I do that, I think it's worth taking a moment now that our house of cards and our clear consensus narrative for horse domestication is sort of, exploded, fallen down before our eyes. It might be worth sort of reflecting for a moment on what actually are we looking for? What is domestication and how do we trace it? Because I think, science is moving full steam ahead towards finding the first domestication, and it often does not always stop and take stock of what actually is it and how would we find it, right? And I think this is particularly unique problem to domestication because we all have constant interactions with domestic animals. We understand that domestication itself is this sort of crucial, pervasive process that in some ways sort of gave us the world around us today. And we kind of have this thing where we know it when we see it, right? Out here in Western North America, we have feral or wild horses, and we have domestic horses. And it's intuitive to me to know, okay, I'm riding a horse. I see some things in the chat. I'm just going to ignore them until the end, because otherwise I have a one-track brain and it'll get confused
No, no,
here.
you just ignore them. People put
Okay.
them into the chat, we will discuss them.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I know a domestic horse and a wild horse intuitively. I can kind of just tell you based on vibes what one is or isn't. I have a domestic dog on my couch and I know the difference between a wolf, right? Um, but if we actually look at what the concept, the word domestication implies, it can be an extraordinary range of things packaged into one word, right? Sometimes people are treating this as the binary. Yes, it's domestic. No, it's wild, right? Sometimes people with horses, we're talking about aspects of an animal letting me jump on its back and ride it around, right? In other cases, we're talking about extraordinarily complex elements of sort of evolutionary dynamics, right? Or when I always open my courses by asking students like to define domestication. And then I put a big whiteboard up of like all the words that come out of their mouths. And there's a whole lot of things that come out, some of which are very different than each other. And probably for every single animal around there that we might consider domestic, a slightly different configuration of these is kind of being thrown together, right? Well, I've got a parakeet on my shoulder. I might be thinking about a lot about its sort of communication and cohabitation, but I've got like uh, elephants that are tamed and reproducing in the wild, but carrying me around for transportation in areas of Southeast Asia. And I think what's important to understand is that every time we talk about domestication, we're pulling together a wide range of these different things, some of which are, I would put in the banner of kind of elements of evolution or ecology, right? So these are elements of changes to the life history, kind of where people understand that our connection with animals became permanent in some way. Some of these things were genetic, um, sort of co-evolving, adapting, changing life history. And a lot of these are are purely relational, right? They're about relationships between people and animals, right? And these things might, but not always, include things like control or management of food and space and reproduction. They could, as in the case of horses, um, involve something pretty unusual in the broad spectrum of human-animal relationships. Transportation. Wow, that's a wild one, right? Um, Sometimes people end up talking about things like milk or wool, and all of these things are kind of a chaotic milieu of different pieces of relationships and domestication. And it's not always possible to like pick, you know, I used to when I give talk about domestication, like put up a nice clean definition where I said, okay, here's what I mean. And that way people could say, well, what about this? And I'd say, well, that's not domestication. I don't do that anymore, in large part because I think it's important that we accept this messiness for what it is. And when we try to turn it into science about the past, we need to be clear about which things here are of interest and try to connect them all together to the best of our ability, right? Okay, so that was a lot. You can tell I like to ramble on this topic. Um, One of the challenges here with the archaeological record, as Anastasia so correctly mentioned, is that we're going way back into the past where we sort of outstrip our ability to trace most of the things on this slide very easily, right? We're now asking archaeologists, such as many of you and myself, to like take a time machine beyond the limits most of the time of like historic documents. Um, somebody saying Bob was here and Bob rode a horse, and to try to reconstruct these complex things. And for the most part, when people sat down to begin doing this in archaeology, they only had very, very indirect measures of relationships. And in fact, things that may not really measure relationships at all to work with. So a lot of the scholarship on domestication that began tackling this topic would do things like measure changes in horse bone size or shape, right? Or just sort of count changes in the frequency or distribution of horse bones at archaeological sites. And unfortunately, at best, these metrics are really tracing not what's at the sort of top of the page here in our or bottom of the page here in our relational category, but more something in the top half of the page here, some sort of, change in life history or evolution. And in terms of their ability to tell us a lot about human connection with horses, I'm going to give them my first of many thumbs down of the day, a big red thumbs down in their ability to sort of accurately track what I think and what I will argue is the most important thing for us to study, which is unique relationships between people and horses. As science has expanded our toolkit into, the 21st century, all the big bucks and all the big headlines and all of the excitement in science tends to focus on biomolecular techniques and especially on things like ancient DNA, which are absolutely amazing and have totally changed our ability to explore um, the past in terms of animals and people. But they are also usually not measuring anything particular about relationships, right? So if you look into a headline around, X animal was domesticated, in X number of years ago, and you kind of open up the methods section, you're going to see a lot about things like population demographic changes, demographic expansion, bottlenecks, selective pressure, and in many ways, what these approaches are really good at doing is telling us, taking one like or many lineages and tracing them to their root of the tree, right? So they can be really nice at fact finding like a place to start looking for evidence of domestication. But they really don't actually directly tell us anything about people's relationship with animals. And I think that that's crucial point to start with in discussing this issue is that, these lines of evidence on themselves, I won't say they're irrelevant to domestication, but at their face, they are tracing things that may be ultimately sort of evolutionary and ecological in origin and only a second state order of connection to human behavior, right? So depending on how they're used, They can either get a sideways thumbs for me as a, mixed, potentially useful tool, all the way down to like a big thumbs down, which is where I think a lot, not necessarily with horses, but a lot of animal genomics around domestication, I think is quite poorly connected to what we actually want to know. It's worth mentioning too that there are a lot of things we can trace archaeologically that are obviously about relationships, but not necessarily unique ones to domestication, right? So with horses, we have tens of thousands of years of like extraordinary evidence of connection to people. Horses are the number one animal in Paleolithic cave art in Europe and Asia and even North Africa. They are like the number one animal bone in Pleistocene archaeological sites. And there are even times in which animal bones, like horses and others, are included in things like burials, right? In which context would say, wow, this is important. Um, and I want us to focus on today on what we can actually learn from the unique relationships that we think are important when we say the word domestication. And so while these are cool and useful, I think we need to be skeptical as to which ones distinguish what we're interested in from, what might have been widespread in the past, even going tens of thousands of years. And my sort of core argument for today's talk is that to understand or explore domestication, what we need are ways to trace relationships that we think are unique and that we think are connected in some way to, what makes our modern or historic relationship with horses important. And I'm by no means attempting to tell you every kind of relationship between people and horses that I think is unique. But I picked four of them that come up a lot that I'm going to talk about how we can trace them, right? And these are, I think, some unique relationships that might fall into the bin of domestication that we have some ability to study scientifically. And that is managing and controlling horse reproduction, um, keeping horses in captivity, using horses for milk, which is, in a place like Mongolia where I do a lot of my work today, still an absolutely crucial sort of socio-cultural role for horses. And then finally, the big ticket item with horses is always transportation, right? And oftentimes, you what is really being discussed when people say horse domestication is transportation and almost nothing else. Um, So I got my little sippy cup here with coffee. Sorry. Let's start with talking about managing reproduction. So if you do look up definitions for domestication that are kind of span different livestock animals, oftentimes this word reproduction is one of the key um, traits assessed as like the important one for distinguishing uh, domestication relationships. Um, it's obvious that the control over animal reproduction is one of the main vehicles for, things like a sort of sustained evolutionary legacy to a relationship between people and animals. It's if you spend time in with animals today, whether you have horses or another animal, here comes my little dingo dog behind me. You probably have controlled their reproduction in some fashion, right? This is um, a basic and foundational behavior around that we would link with domestication. With horses, there are times that we can really trace um, this process pretty clearly, right? They are pretty rare, but they are present. And one of the most easy and obvious ways we can trace reproduction is when we have evidence of castration. So there are, if you go into the record of Central Asia, you can find mummified horses that have soft tissue remaining, um, in which you can just sort of inspect and see, oh, okay, it looks as though, the testicles were removed from this horse in antiquity, right? That's very compelling evidence of control over reproduction, right? It's very rare that that level of like ice mummy clarity is available for tracing things like control over an individual animal's reproductive organs. There are other proxies that are a little bit less nice. The skeleton responds to castration in somewhat predictable, but I would say individually kind of dangerous to sort of assess ways. Um, there's another technique though that I think is a very powerful one and pretty much across the board one of our most useful tools for understanding reproduction and control, which is to understand that human behavior is what is aggregating assemblages of animal bones. And when human behavior involves making choices around trying to keep a group of animals fertile, reproducing high numbers year to year, um, there are choices you can make and choices you can't. And one of the choices you really can't make is to kill breeding age animals, and especially female animals, right? Because if you have one reproductively active male in a hierarchical herd, they can make up for a lot of other males, right? And still have a reproducing herd. You very quickly run into a demographic cliff when you start to cull or slaughter reproductively eligible females. And so across species, livestock species, like tracking domestication. This is the foundation of Mindy Zader's 2000 science paper on the origins of goat domestication, right? It's like the hallmark of herd management is that you start to cull young animals before they hit reproductive age, mostly male animals, and then you cull animals once they've kind of aged out of having an impact on your herd fertility, right? So we get assemblages that look like at the bottom here, kind of a spike of young, a dead zone in the healthy reproductive age, and then a spike of old animals. And they're big contrast with hunted assemblages in which people are just trying to get the, biggest, healthiest animal. And so you often end up with, um, things that look like a big spike at prime age, very few young animals, and kind of tailing off as you get older, because that's how life is in the wild, right? So this is like one of our most powerful tools, and really, I think gives us the ability to explore herd management in detail. Um, Unfortunately, oops, I don't know what's happening here to my. All right, I'm losing my little guy. I'm gonna have to be looking off to the side now. There are it's become very, very popular to study this topic using genomic data. Um, this is I forget should have put the title here. This is carved out from one of the recent genomic papers on horse domestication, and there are a lot of ways that controlling reproduction might hypothetically show up in genomics, right? Things like generation time, demographic evidence of expanding demography, population bottlenecks. Unfortunately, almost all of those things also change with natural variables in the wild, right? Animals, populations grow, they shrink. Generation time responds to ecological variables. And so, these have become almost the primary way that we assess things like control over ancient animal reproduction. They're like two or three steps removed from human behavior, unlike our archaeological results. And so I give them a thumbs down. I thought about giving them a sideways orange thumb here, but I just think the way in which they've been applied, which is to treat them as evidence of reproduction and control, edges me towards grumpiness on their current use in the genomics literature. Um, okay. Second thing here is identifying captivity. And this is a complicated one with horses, because the role of captivity in horse pastoralism and horse herding and horse riding, it varies a lot around the world. Those of us in the Western world, America, Europe, we're probably pretty comfortable with the idea of a horse living in like a barn or a stall or that sort of thing. And we may sort of presume that when we're looking in horse domestication, what we really need to identify are things like paddocks and corrals and fences. I'm a little bit not sure that is the case from my time, especially in Central Asia. One of the things that has come up a lot here are things like, hypothesized corrals and post holes as places to look for evidence of domestication. This is from the Botai site, and this kind of geophysics evidence of post holes was being paired with, some pretty low resolution assessments of, like, for example, high phosphorus levels, right? Which are evidence of concentrated organic activity, but don't necessarily link us to horses in any particular way. And I'm going to give this um, in particular a thumbs down for a couple of reasons. One of these is just over time I've become more skeptical that our origins of horse domestication actually have to do with a whole lot with captivity. I mean, if you spend time around horses in the steppe, you will find places and spaces in which horses are occasionally concentrated, corralled, or tied up. Most of the time, corrals, are actually being used for other animals, and horses are spending their time sort of free ranging in places like Mongolia. And in Mongolia, when horses are tied, I like this picture because if you look closely, these horses are not actually really in the corral. It's just that the babies were tied, right? And that the moms and others has sort of aggregated affiliatively with these animals. Most of the time, a lot of pastoral horse control, is looks something like this, like a group of horses kind of free grazing in the wild, with one or two animals maybe hobbled or tied close quarters. And so, um, one of the things that I think is important is our toolkit for tracing corral areas. If we want to find an area where there definitely was a lot of horses and, they were pooping in the same spot over and over again, we now have tools like kind of fecal biomarkers that would allow us to make like a scientific signature to say, hey, this poop came from a horse, or it came from a human, or it came from a sheep, or, this isn't poop at all, right? And none of this work, well, this work is not, I give it either a sideways or a thumbs up because it's not magic, and it certainly, can't um, it needs to be done cautiously and carefully. None of this work has been done for a lot of our sites supposedly associated with early horse sort of corralling or captivity. There are other things that we could look at that would apply to captivity. For example, some cases you might have horses that are being fed an artificial diet, which, um, could show up in an indirect way in their dentition if you're careful, and if the crucially, like, if you really know the local isotopes, if the local vegetation and the vegetation of the domestic grain are all sort of aligning in a way that make it feasible to trace. You can sometimes trace things like artificial feeding of horses, changes in mobility. This is just very complicated and hard to do well, which is why I give it it's a powerful tool, but it's risky, and the conclusions are not always clear, right? Unfortunately, anything to do with isotopes is like cool and interesting. We should definitely do it, and it might be wrong, and that's just kind of how isotopes work in terms of their ability to trace these things. All right. Um, then we have horse milk, and this is an interesting and controversial one. Some of my doubts on this topic might be somewhat controversial for folks. Um, Identifying horse milk is sort of one of the foundational tenets of how we think about, domestication. It's also the thing in which methods have changed probably the most of any in the last 15 years, right? So we know today horse milk is really important part of a lot of steppe cultures. Lots of literature out there about the role of horse milk in, steppe pastoralism, nutrition. It's a incredible, and not everyone likes it. Today I think I get a lot of my students give the icky face when they encounter horse milk for the first time, but very, very influential part of steppe prehistory. Um, our basis, sorry, I can't speak English today. Um, our basis for understanding horse milk and when it began in the past is really this 2009, and then a couple of other follow-up papers on Botai. And if you dig in, it took me a while to sort of realize this, but if you dig into the methods of where the argument for horse milk at Botai comes from, what is actually being measured here are fats, right? Isotope measurements of fats found in this case on ceramics, um, and kind of taking isotope measurements on those fats and comparing them to other, sort of reference fats, right? And so this graph nicely shows, I think probably uncontroversially that the horse fats recovered at Botai are clustering with other horse fats, right? Um, that's not the same thing, though, as proving that they come from milk, right? And the chain there of going from suggesting through a reference panel that we're looking at horse fats to suggesting confidently that we're looking at horse milk is actually quite a complicated logic chain around seasonality, deuterium isotopes, and like context, right? And I think unfortunately that context looks a little different now today than it did in 2009 when this came out. And my most controversial thumbs down of the day here is going to be I'd probably give this technique in general a lot of risk being isotope related, and given the other tools we now have available, sort of a big red thumbs down in terms of its what we know about the past now in in the last decade, this sort of superpower has emerged to take um, proteins recovered from human dental calculus, which can be identified in an extraordinary level of specificity to things like bacteria, viruses, different plants people are eating. But in particular, the cool one from my perspective has been our ability to trace species of milk products that people were eating, right? Um, and so in our collaboration in Mongolia, we found, these sort of pop up at the same time horse domestication did. There can be potentially really nice, and I give them in general like a big thumbs up because they're at least genus, if not species specific. They are um, directly linked to milk, right? So it's not a chain of inferences taking us back to fats and these kind of things. They can be basically a direct indicator of milk. Now, some of the other challenges around contextualizing, individual events do involve some wrinkles, and we'll talk about that in just a second as I wrap up. Um, but finally, here, our key one for horses is transport. And this is, there is an explosion of ways that we can track horse transport in the archaeological record, some of which have been around forever and are just as simple and straightforward as they were, 100, 500 years ago, um, today as they were then. So sometimes it's very, very easy to identify horse transport in the archaeological record. I put this example up because sometimes you have pits of animals buried with chariots, right? Or sometimes you've got a horse buried with a saddle, buried with a person, buried with equipment, and sometimes all you need is a little bit of context, right? Um, this is the easiest and somehow after, 50, 100 years of this, in many ways the most conclusive approach for understanding when horse transport began in the archaeological record. At a certain point, we intersect with more standard, um, forms of evidence, things like visual depictions of horses, iconography, or even text. These can run the gamut here from being really obvious and good, like a photograph of a human and a horse. That's great evidence that, someone was riding a horse, down to things that are pretty, I would say, ambiguous. Like this one, I think it's in the British Museum, and it was initially identified as a wolfhound by the person who published it in the 20s. Um, Sometimes iconography is very, very hard to infer. Like, is that a dog? Is it a donkey? Is it a horse? Is it, taxonomic identification of a little clay tablet may be a little bit tougher, right? So I give this a whole range of potential that really depends a lot on how clear it is and what information goes along with it. Most of the time, though, we're forced to sort of grasp at other straws. And one of the things that has been, of interest from the beginning is tracing what we recognize as like the key tool that folks use to control horses, the bridle, um, or the bit, right? And the same thing applies to bridles and bits as to my prior comments here, sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes you get um, animal that was buried with the thing in its mouth, and it's clear that what we're looking at is a piece of bridle and horse equipment. More often, though, the controversy around domestication centers upon isolated artifacts, right? That we infer might be bridal components, like a cheek piece, right? And so for a long time, people sort of pointed at different, there have been a number of swings and misses in the archaeological record of like thing that looks like might be a bridle, people assuming it was, and then later sort of discovering, in this case, this is one of these, so artifacts that was debated as a cheek piece for a while from the fourth millennium BC. Eventually, found in context here with cattle and showing that it was a nose ring, right? So we can't. I would say, as isolated objects, things like this are really a terrible source of information about horse transport, unless context allows us to know that that's what they were used for, right? More controversially have been the development of proxies for bridling in the equine osteological record, right? And this is if you don't know me, I've gotten into big fights about this. Some people do not really like what I have to say on this topic, but our 1974, Juliet Clattenbrock published a paper here sort of suggesting correctly that occasionally the use of a bridle mouthpiece in a horse's mouth causes damage that we can recognize archaeologically, right? And in fact, Juliet was building upon decades earlier observations. And if you don't believe me, go to Mongolia and look in a horse's mouth sometime and see what's happening to their teeth. The mechanical abrasion between a bit and the tooth of a horse can damage it in a way that you can recognize and see archaeologically. Recognizing this has given us a powerful toolkit to find instances of horse transport in the archaeological record, but it perhaps has gone so far as folks to suggest that individual cases of an apparently abraded tooth might be sort of uncontroversial evidence of that particular horse was bridled. And my colleague Christina Barron Ortiz and I um, put together a cautionary note on this topic by looking at a whole range of kind of Ice Age wild horses in which we recognize that many times the behavior of the sort of dentition of a single horse can intersect with things like banding in the cementum, enamel hypoplasia, and some things that we basically just have to be very, very careful to take an individual tooth and interpret that as evidence that an animal was used with a bridle and a bit. So on its own, one specimen with one type of little pathology, thumbs down for me. But if you can look at a whole skeleton, if you can look at a well-preserved specimen, and you can be curious about the different ways that using a bridle might mechanically interact with the body, there's a whole range of interesting things there, ranging from abrasion, pathologies linked with exertion or posture, leverage, or even, sort of arthritis of the jaw. And I think that when you start to do this, both multiple methods for a single animal, as well as looking at whole populations, groups of animals, and exploring patterning, that's when this can really move into a powerful tool or even a big green thumbs up from me. Um, in addition to the bridle itself, which is, a key vehicle for communication, a lot of times folks are looking for other evidence for riding. And one of the more popular, tools that people look at is the way, any of us who ride horses, we know what's going on here. This stuff hurts parts of your body over time, and especially like the hips and the lower back. My lower back is just absolutely wrecked this week. Um, and to recognize that these things can potentially have osteological or skeletal features that often get called horse rider syndrome, right? So even recently, folks have published papers sort of solely on the basis of human skeletal changes saying, hey, this is horse riding, right? Unfortunately, it's not quite as straightforward as it seems because a lot of the other things humans can do with their skeleton also involve the hips and the lower back. There's going to be subtle differences Absolutely. Between riding a horse, standing in a chariot. Last week we went out, there's like a Colorado chariots sort of place out there, and we went out and did some chariot driving and sort of figuring out where you actually do get sore. And I'm not saying that there's no differences between different transport strategies, riding an ox cart, sitting in your computer chair writing emails. There clearly are differences. However, the kind of equifinality means that the way that this is currently being used, I think as like a yes or no marker of horse riding, gets for me a thumbs down. And in the future, if we're able to develop reference populations and more subtle metrics of how the human skeleton might differ across, these different strategies, I think it has potential here to be useful. But as currently applied, I think pretty poor. Another thing where we've made a lot of progress here is in the ability to recognize the whole patterning in the whole horse skeleton related with different kinds of transport, right? So we did a study here a few years ago looking at enthesial skeletal changes in horses used to pull Chinese chariots and those, in an early riding, especially before the saddle, and showing that, vertebral pathologies can be one of our most powerful tools as with all other pathologies, if you show me one broken vertebrae, I really don't think they can be used as a marker of yes or no on riding, but especially larger patterning, full skeletons, these are great and powerful tools. So I'm going to conclude by talking about what I think my sort of grumpy, skeptical sort of rankings about evidence quality tell us about bow tie and horse domestication. And I think, you can probably already guess from some of my assessments that have trickled in so far, I don't think the bow tie model fares very well on this kind of more critical assessment of the evidence. In particular, if we look at the most like strong classic measures of, reproduction, it pretty much looks like bow tie horses were hunted. And in fact, some of the horses at bow tie, I believe, included pregnant mares that were killed. Some of the horses have harpoons embedded in their ribs, which, is I think pretty obvious indicator that they were hunted. And so even, I think even people that support bow tie model would sort of concede that many, if not most, of the animals there were hunted. So big, I get the thumbs down. I already talked to you about my feelings about corralling in captivity here. I just don't think that any of the high quality metrics for things like horse dung or spaces that are dominated by horses as opposed to humans or some other source have been performed here. For for milking, I think we're sort of left with this um, isotope data as the best information there is. And I don't think, so far any of the real solid markers of milk have come through, things like milk proteins from human dental calculus. I think it's sort of twiddling my thumbs, waiting for these strong indicators of milk to show up. And I think, Alicia Ventresca Miller just published a great book, Domesticated. She got a whole chapter here talking about the issues with the isotopes. So take it from her if you want, somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. I already said what I think about the one single horse tooth at bow tie, and whether that should constitute paleopathological evidence for riding. My view is definitely no, especially in light of the fact that no other markers from any of the exertion, posture, vertebral damage, anything like that has yet to be reported from bow tie. So the picture doesn't look very rosy there if we zoom out and take a more cautious look at the evidence. Um, so what do we actually have to say about horse domestication? A lot of the language that's been spilled lately, language doesn't get spilled, ink that's been spilled on this topic lately has been on something called the Dom2 lineage. Because what has emerged to fill the void here, these sort of genomic fact finding that have pointed us towards a time and a place in which there appears to have been like, takes us to the very first members of the lineages of animals that we recognize today, appears to have sort of radiated dramatically out of a very small region of kind of, north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. But unlike our Kurgan hypothesis, we're talking about after 2000 BC. And some of the earliest inklings of those lineages might go back a few centuries before, but those are just lineages, right? They're not really telling us about relationships, domestication per se. So we've gotten oriented to the when and the where, but we really don't have anything to say on the why and the how. And part of the reason for that is that our archaeological record here is sort of underneath this sort of horrific active war zone. And in particular, right, we're talking about museum collections, archaeological sites of across Western Russia, across Ukraine, regions that are sort of geopolitically inaccessible for reanalysis at the moment. And a place where horses are right now actually being involved in sort of combat on the battlefield. It's horrible stuff, and unfortunately means that we have a kind of a void left other than these a little bit of genomic clues to answer what was happening with people and horses there. There are some things that we can point to, and I was part of this team in 2021 that put together a proper horse milk dental calculus paper from this region and did identify one horse or equus milk protein that was supposedly dated to around 3000 BC. It has not held up to recent kind of independent testing of other larger samples from across this region. There was another paper that just came out right after that basically showing right now I think it's a single specimen of supposedly having a horse milk protein until about 1000 BC when they start to become common in the record. So kind of confusing signals from the milk. Interestingly, our big sort of fuss of ancient genomics has point us back towards almost the same answer that we would get from like the most boring classic archaeological data sets, which is when horses begin being buried with bridle components and partial chariots in the Sintashta culture around 2000 BC and kind of the Ural region of Russia. This is pretty much, just post-dating our first genetic evidence of the animals that would then, disperse across Eurasia and we know today as domestic horses. So I'd say that that framework um, points us for this region of the kind of Black Sea region at around, prior to 2000 BC with a lot more questions than answers. I think it's clear that horses had a key role in transport, and we don't really have a lot of the data sets that we would like to assess what else might have been going on, right? And I think it's time, that we work towards trying to reintegrate the genomic data, the archaeological data, and to zoom out and understand the context here between horse domestication and the rest of the continent. I think I personally start to question now whether there even is such a thing as a prey pathway, which is a term you'll hear a lot of times in discussing botai. The idea that you can kind of structurally hunt your animals more and more towards the result of a domestication. The reason I say this is the genomic markers we do have that relate to things like selection and behavior tell us that aggression and fear responses are probably the most important change between a wild progenitor and a domestic animal. And, evolutionary dynamics do not really permit intensified hunting to result in these kind of dropping of a fear dynamics or aggression. If we zoom out a little bit as well, we understand that the difference between 4000 BC and 2000 BC is a big one in terms of what else was going on in Western Asia and even Northeast Africa with other animals. In the fifth millennium BC, we're starting to get early evidence of animals being used for transport. Things like cattle sledges, wagons get developed in the fourth millennium BC, and by around 3000 BC, we have evidence of equids being domesticated that are not the horse. Initially, the donkey, right? And in fact, the donkey quickly spreads out of their source of sort of domestication into places like Mesopotamia, where we do have historic records or at least iconographic depictions that start to show their use in things like wagons, transport, like carts that look a lot like chariots. We even have evidence that other equids started to get plugged into this emerging kind of techno-cultural tradition. Animals that today, continue to live in the wild, the Asian wild ass or Equus hemionus onager, have been used for transport, and people were experimenting. They were hybridizing donkey and wild ass, trying to find animals that moved faster and kind of improve the sort of speed and flexibility of this new tradition. I don't have a lot of ways that I can tell you how these processes connect, but I don't think it's an accident that it is the edges of the Eurasian steppe, right? Not the like open grasslands of Mongolia or the forest steppes of Kazakhstan, where we're starting to see the first evidence for domestic horses appear, genetically, chronologically. I think that there is a connection here. And I think it has to do with shifting relationships between people and agriculture and technology and other animals. And I think that we really need to lean into this and try to explore, what elements, if anything, did things like captivity and reproduction and milk have to do with this process, or was it purely, oriented towards the role of horses in transport? And to try to link these kind of evolutionary things, our genomic, our population dynamics with actual behaviors, choices, and relationships between people and horses. So I think, basically to conclude, I think we're in a problem point here where our technology has sort of outkicked the coverage, to use an American football metaphor, um, by conflating ecological and evolutionary processes with the direct marker of relationships and domestication. I think that if we build narratives that are connecting this relevant and important genomic data with our strong and robust metrics of the unique relationships of interest, we're going to be much happier with our resulting archaeological models. And right now, those models don't have a lot of clarity here for explaining the why and the how of that initial domestication. I do think they give us I give a big thumbs down to the state of knowledge around Botai and its relevance for our understanding of domestication. But I think there's just a lot to be learned about what's actually going on here. And if we work harder to build strong models, we're gonna, I think, be much happier with the explanatory power of our results. So it's an hour. I will stop talking, and I will be look forward to hearing some questions and hearing from you all here in the audience. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, William. And we had a little side kind of discussion,
Okay.
um, but people can ask their questions, definitely make their comments, and we've been agreeing to some of the things you said. Like from personal experience, I would say that regarding Rider's syndrome, there are lots of things which can affect your body in similar ways. I'm a rider, but I also started like cross-country skiing this winter, and it gives you very similar strain in the body. I don't say people in Batai were cross-country skiers or wherever in Yamna culture, but there are lots of these activities. If you have a limited number of bones which are damaged, I'm not an archaeologist, but it could be quite hard to identify what's going on. I would suggest you might get if I don't know somebody who is working in human physiology today and see
Yeah,
what.
we're working on this question. Our plan was to explore. Thanks for coming, Angela. Um, uh, our idea was to explore contexts where we did know what people were doing quite clearly and look into more, just as we've done with horses, subtle differences, right? I'm sure that there are skeletal differences between somebody that's ridden a horse their whole life and somebody that's driven a chariot their whole life or somebody that's driven a wagon. But we gotta, I'm also, I strongly suspect that they are small and subtle differences, right? They might be differences of degree rather than presence absence of a particular pathology. And I'm actually curious about whether there might even be small skeletal differences between the pre-stirrup and post-stirrup era, right? When you distribute your weight differently for a long period of time. And so we are trying to work on this a little bit in Mongolia, comparing our slices of time, second millennium, first millennium BC, first millennium CE, just to see if we can build. I'm not saying they're not useful. I just think we want to explore patterning and frequency and intensity rather than just presence absence. And then I think there could be some cool results.
Yeah, so Kate was commenting she has to go, but actually when we were publishing one of her studies, we had the same response from the reviewer that different types of saddle, different ways of riding can put different stress on your body, and that's
Yeah.
absolutely true. So we don't know how they were riding. We don't have depictions. Or we can compare them to like bareback riders in later societies, but yeah, we don't actually know that too. And even today, there are different types of saddle which will affect your body in very different ways. So, yeah, you need to be careful with this. But I think people might want to have kind of more comments, questions. So. Kate pointed out there is Birgit here who's
Yeah,
been
I see
saying
Kate, comment from
something.
Kate. That's a really good observation, Kate. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Um, Birgit, do you have any comments about this? I remember you were talking about something similar to a conference. Anyway, so the other thing I wanted to mention is that people are often like kind of unhappy about taxonomy. So if you have the word feral, it's kind of sort of devalues horses. You have wild, they get all sorts of legal protection. That's
Yeah.
again we had this problem with one current publication where the authors were calling American horses wild. They're not truly wild, but if you call them feral, then they are not entitled to this legal protection.
Yeah, I think the a lot of our, it's rare that as archaeologists our work actually intersects with like the world around us. And this is one of those areas where there is that intersection of the word wild is immediately legally and emotionally relevant for conservation stuff. And yeah, in the Western US, the distinction between feral and wild is one of kind of life or death question around, the litigation and efforts around uh, horses on public lands. And the same sort of potential risk is there around, the Przewalski horse um, in not everywhere. It's not going to land the same everywhere, but we should be aware that the argument for them being feral, if it's a fact, it's a fact, right? And we use we can't hide the truth just because it has negative consequences. But I think we should be very, very cautious about telegraphing things as fact if they are um, if they're a little bit dubious and they have the potential for negative outcomes. So that's why I would like to consider more assessment of that question or the idea that they are fertilized. I mean, I didn't talk at length about that idea that Przewalski horse are feral, but basically it's from a nestedness analysis between the reference horses we have, which are mostly 19th and 20th century horses, and like this big batch at like 3500 BC with Botai, and there's not a lot of samples in between those 2 points, and so I think my confidence in that analysis being correct is low. But again, I'm not a geneticist, so you can feel free to ignore my hot take opinions on it. So
like people do have opinions, and I discussed this in another event with Ludovic Orlando, and I wasn't convinced by his arguments, but then again, I'm also not a geneticist.
Yeah.
Um, but you
I
also
think,
see this discourse with other species. Like in Latvia, we have rewilding sites where Polish conics are, and people get upset when I say they're not wild. Well, obviously, they're domestic horses. I have a Polish conic which was brought from one of these sites, and we kind of trained her under saddle in 5 months. That's a normal schedule for any kind of stud bred horse which hasn't been introduced to tech before. I have worked with bred warm bloods which hadn't undergone any prior training, and at the same timeline, you also need 5 months. So, and yeah, it's a well-known fact that Polish conics are not wild horses. They're not tarpans, whatever. And still,
yeah.
people get upset when I point that
Yeah, I
out.
mean it's right. Everything is it's always political with horses because horses matter so much to everybody today still. So let's see, I got a comment from John.
Oh,
Um,
John, maybe you can also unmute, kind of speak about it. We don't want
yeah,
to.
first part of your question, John, I do think we're recording it and hopefully, you know, you have a chance to look over if you want to hear me rambling the beginning about Botai. But your second question is, is it worth looking at secondary benefits of domestication? Horses, milk, sheep, wool, reindeer horns. Yeah, I think I agree with you that ultimately the most useful way to think about domestication are to look at aspects or relationships of interests, right? So horse milk is extraordinarily important thing to look for. And it may be secondary, right? It may be that these things that we call secondary products or whatever, they might come after some other thing. They might not always, though. I think we should stay curious about what relationships we can see and how we can see them because we might learn that, one of those things in particular was really important and that's why the relationship started, and that things that come afterwards um, might have been things we would informally think of as a secondary product. Like in horses, I encounter always this sort of hardwired belief that there was a progression from meat to milk to riding with horses. And I wanted to underscore, I don't think we have any proof of that. Right now, the only thing we have evidence of that is unassailable is riding or chariots or whatever first, and then maybe there's a shaky argument for milk before, and we have none of that like raising stuff. And so in Mongolia, where I know the record much better and I can speak more confidently, like um, the meat and the milk stuff came after, right? It's the transport that came rolling in, and then you had horse milk showing up, and so I think we should stay curious about what is the secondary product and what's the primary, and as long as we looking at all as many relationships as we can through different methods and lenses, we'll probably learn more. I see another question here. Uh, yeah, hi Cecilia. Sorry I didn't get to talk with you, but good to see you. I liked your Cecilia had a good paper about horses just out this week. That was cool. Encourage everybody to check it out. Um, the other question there was about changes in let's see. I guess the question is asking about size. I mean, there is an interesting set of findings coming out in the first millennium BC, which is that uh those of people that are doing things like measuring horse height and stuff over time, the first horses were very short and they remained short for a very long time. I think in many ways reflecting that their more predominant use was in chariots. And I discovered last week, like, why you don't want a tall chariot horse. It's like you gotta, see over the top. But there is a interesting genetic result of a very gentle selective pressure for taller horses emerging in the first millennium BC that also seems to show up with like measurements of withers height and stuff that we have archaeologically.
Yeah, I think just
Uh,
people overestimate the issue of size because they always think that big horses are the ones which you can ride, and actually it's not true. We can ride much smaller horses. Today there is like 20% of horses' body weight is what the rider should be like
yeah,
is that
there's a
horse can
difference
carry.
between tall and strong. And I mean, I am a person who weighs 100 kilos, and I ride horses in Mongolia all the time. Um, and the first time I did it, my father told me I looked like I was riding a dog. It's certainly not like a big symbol of masculine strength when I'm on a horse, but a strong Mongolian horse does fine with me on long, 2 week long trail trips. And so, I think height is probably the changes in height are more of a reflection around preferences for horses in things like, military or cavalry than they were about riding per se. But
Yeah, it doesn't reflect. There are lots of like small horses which can carry heavy weights. My husband is also show
yeah,
jumping with our Polish Konik, so there
yeah,
are of course limitations, but not so much. And we have a Shetland pony, and teenager kids have been sitting on him. It's not something we usually do, but we had teenagers who sat on him and walk, and kind of he didn't protest. As he would if he wouldn't be comfortable. And so it's kind of people are looking using modern assumptions, I guess.
yeah. I see a comment from Abby
Mm.
about yeah, I mean, truthfully, so I deal with this question of feral versus wild a lot here. It's almost the first thing out of people's mouth in the Western US. And the truth is I was talking to my colleague Christina Barron Ortiz, who's specialist in Pleistocene horses and paleontology. And, the truth is there's very little difference. A paleontologist often could not recognize effectively the difference between uh, domestic horses that are there today and the animals that lived here in the Ice Age, right? In fact, there are a number of like fake species that were identified, domestic horses that were misidentified by early paleontologists and became, a species because they were similar but a little different. And I think like because our journey with horses looks different than other domestic animals. It's not the same as our journey with dogs or sheep or cattle. And like, it does seem that it started later. And a lot of the early genomic evidence that's coming out shows that there are not really a lot of changes to horses linked to the domestication process. I mean, if we want to call it domestication, the main thing that appears to have changed is their aggression and behavior. So I think it's worth asking what's the difference, between a feral and a wild horse, and especially, I think it's useful. Like these are cultural labels; they're not necessarily like particularly biologically important, and it's useful for us to ask, how how relevant they are when people are making management decisions today. So that's yeah, people do feel free to ask me questions verbally. I don't need to read them all. But um, you do need to speak up.
Yeah, so everyone can join and
Otherwise,
speak.
I'll just drink my sippy cup.
And I also wanted to comment about corals. Like throughout history, horses have been managed without any enclosures. Even I've just finished a book about kind of wild feral horses in medieval Europe. Lots of them were owned horses. They could be managed in a way similar to Mongolia. You just let them out in the wild when you need them, you retrieve them. And
Yeah.
you don't need, or you need some area where you keep your horse while you are using it, but it's not like you always need an enclosure for this horse. That's what happening in New Forest these days. Um, Gail Brownrigg has a study published about it, and she explained how some owners they would just let their horses graze there all summer. If they need a horse for competition, they just take it out of the forest, groom it, load it into the trailer, and go. It's totally fine. Um,
Yeah, Gail has some amazing insights, and I saw, some of the people who have been most interrogating of the relationship between the archaeological ideas and like the different experiences of horses around the world are in this call. I don't actually know Ute Dietz, but I just wanted to shout out. I'm a huge fan of her scholarship, so thank you for your cool papers. They've really helped me learn a lot about horses and um, yeah, and Gail was maybe the one who suggested I come here. I don't know if she's here, but
she never does Zoom. She
if
will
not,
be listening, but she
thank you,
doesn't do
Gail.
Zoom. I don't know. Like technically, she cannot do it. Um, so there was somebody who wanted to ask a question. Oh, okay, Eve wanted has a hand raised. So Eve, please feel free.
Hi, Eve.
Hello, hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my camera working also, but for some reason it's
It's okay. There's a nice picture of you with the horse skull behind you. So
yes, okay. Um, Thank you very much, first of all. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think it gave a lot of good thinking material. What I wanted to ask, and maybe it's something that is kind of like a stupid question, or it's
those are
probably
my favorite kind.
discussed a lot already, but I wanted to ask about the milking and like the milk culture. So if we think about this past uh, use of horse milk, then and right now also we associate it more with the steppe area, Mongolians. There is also some places in Europe maybe where horse milk is more used, but in the past, like, did this milk culture, horse milk culture, move with horses? How much do we know about it? Or was it something that didn't move with horses? Do we find it elsewhere in Europe or Asia, or did it get like stuck to the steppe area, and why?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I can only give you a bad answer, guesses. I mean, I'm not sure we have like a good model for like where the first horse milk was developed and how it spread. One of the reasons for that is like, I showed you this. We've got this one specimen from the Black Sea area where it's like way, way earlier than any other horse milk. I'm not sure what to make of that. Like, I'm a little suspicious about the dating, to be honest, because it's the only one. I think like eventually we'll have some model of like, sort of where it started and how it spread. But my sense about horse milk is that like it's really had its biggest ecological impact and social impact in places where like there's a lot of horses and that the kind of logic around horse pastoralism is, horses are also being used as a livestock animal, right? Which is not like there's a few reasons that horses, you know, only are a livestock animal in certain corners of the world. Um, Most areas of the world really struggled to raise like huge amounts of horses. Um, and those horses were extraordinarily valuable. Like, think about somewhere like Egypt or India, or it's like ecologically, there's not a lot of great horse habitat, and yet these are like the vehicles of power and communication and trade. And um, I in Mongolia, like the best, the areas most famous for their horse milk are like the just wide open sort of eastern steppes. And oh, hi. Hey, cool microphone. Sorry, Eve is my friend, and I haven't seen Eve in like a super long time, so I'm very keen to see Eve. Um, I suspect that like the impact of horse milk was earliest and most pronounced in like the open steppes in places where like the highest populations of horses as like a herd animal were. It's interesting to me that it, you know, didn't develop in other places that were, you could say like the same thing about the, prairies of North America, for example, and we don't really have any dairy tradition out here. So there must be more to it about the culture of dairy pastoralism. And, in Mongolia, the first dairy pastoralism is like 3000 BC. It was around for a long time. And so that framework too, dairy relationship with other animals might have played a part in how and when that developed in Mongolia. It's kind of like will milk anything, and milking reindeer is also like a key part of life for some folks. So yeah, so just a rambling answer to say I don't really know, but I suspect there's like a lot of ecology and maybe a little bit of kind of other dairy culture stuff related in. So
Okay, thank you. So you think it's more, yeah, like ecological than cultural,
well, I mean,
or
I think like in order for it to make sense to milk horses, you have to have a lot of horses, and those horses need to be like happy, right? Like lactation is a very fragile thing for you certainly could not milk horses in a zoo, and so I think it's that interplay between the ecology and culture that is allowed it to happen, and then there's some other magical factor in there that I don't know. So.
Mm. And can I ask a very quick question, one more? When milking a horse, then how many liters or milliliters is milked from one mare in a day, let's say? Is
Oh,
it
that's a
once a
great
day, twice a
question.
day? How
I
is it?
to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. You didn't get, I guess you didn't get to see any horse milking when you're in Mongolia.
I did, but I didn't ask about the volume.
I don't know. I'd say ask me again in July and I can tell you.
Okay,
It would
thanks.
also depend on the breed because some breeds are like dairy breeds, and I think they have in Kazakhstan and Mongolia they have milk and meat breeds. And I have milked also like riding horses, sport horses. They're not milk horses, and I didn't
Yeah.
do it because of that, because there were situations where I had to milk them. But I would suspect that at the earliest stages they wouldn't be specialized for milk, so there wouldn't be a lot of milk. But
Yeah,
nowadays, yeah,
and
they have specialized breeds for that.
Betsy had Betsy is it Betsy? Yeah, sorry, no, my glasses on. Had the observation that, it certainly will interface with other things going on with pastoralism too. The dynamics of dairying and the dynamics of herding for other livestock are are tremendously variable across different sort of micro ecosystems in even in the steppes. So in Mongolia, you have areas that are like major yak areas and other, so that's a good observation too, is those might have all influenced where there was a strong emphasis culturally.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Um, can you see if you see my two messages earlier?
I'm having a hard time following all the messages just because I have like tunnel vision and I'm talking and reading at the same time, like short
So,
circuits in
so
my brain. So
but Anastasia saying that she's seen. I think she's seen it. Can you find out from her if you see my message?
Maybe you could just repeat it. It will be easier because, yeah, there are a lot of them.
All right. I'll send you another text. I'm out at the moment. Cheers.
okay, I'll look back through and see what I.
So John Clark was mentioning like what animals can you consider feral? So feral horses, yes. Feral dogs, yes. Feral cats, definitely. Other feral pigs, feral sheep, feral cattle. It's kind of interesting taxonomical question. I haven't heard this.
Yeah, and I mean, the world is filled with things that are confusing and like, there were wild animals in air quotes that are translocated across oceans. Um, there's situations like the dog in Australia where, we now would ne I don't hear the word feral used very much with the dingo because it's been long enough that they're like reestablished as, as a part of the ecosystem in some, so I think feralization is an interesting process, but feral as a label, I think it's kind of like domestic, right? It's a label that probably doesn't need to be used as a binary. We should, or at least it runs into trouble when it is.
Yeah, so Abby is commenting that it's about biodiversity, rewilding, and then like all the breeds, they are better at adopting. Or that's the same with horses. I always say sport horses would be useless for rewilding. They wouldn't know a second thing how to look after themselves. But like local ponies used in rewilding, they don't become wild. You can easily take and train them, but they're
Speaking of
used in rewilding
feral
process.
animals, this is my
Yeah, hello.
feral animal here. This is
Uh,
Indy.
I think the interesting thing about all of this feral and wild stuff is, to me, is just simply that horses are closer to their distant, non-domesticated past in some sense. And so the horses just the second they can, they regroup themselves in societies that are really recognizable across time, across cultures, across breeds, across types. And they do that really successfully if they're left to their own devices and they have enough um, territory to do it in.
Yeah, that's totally true, and it's a great point. And there, there's the observation that like a lot of the things we take as for granted as like differences between a domestic horse and a wild horse or what have you are not really genomically or evolutionarily encoded. Most of uh, the horses around here, for example, are like a few generations removed from like a being like a I don't know American quarter horse or something like. But there's an extraordinary amount of morphological change within like even like one generation from a horse that is removed from a highly restricted breeding environment and also a captive environment into a open grassland. And there are one of the first things that people say when they visit Mongolia is, wow, look at these wild horses. And then if you go closer, you might see that they have a brand on their flank or something. But because they're, essentially living in a free grazing and also social structures that approximate the same sort of life for a lot of what we call feral animals. So there's the lines are blurry and the the domestication of horses was recent and it was not this isn't like some evolutionary state change from one to the other. Like they're pretty much the same animal in a lot of ways, and so that's a good point.
uh, Nobody else has a question. I wanted to ask about goat domestication because you mentioned it, and I'm fascinated by goats. There isn't a lot of scholarship, at least in medieval studies, about goats. And
Yeah.
as I have two pet goats, who I think are much cleverer than horses and much harder to manage. I'm just fascinated. What can you say about how do we know when goats were domesticated? Not sure they got domesticated. The way my goats behave, they're surely feral, wild.
Well, I mean I agree with you. Goats are amazing, My favorite animal of all animals is probably the baby goat, because they are so adorable, but also mischievous and intelligent. And goat domestication is probably the first livestock domestication relationship. Um, we don't know a lot, but there is some good work by Mindy Zader, and then there's been some recent genomics work and stuff. And um, ultimately, what they have found around interrogating the very beginnings of goat domestication is that, well, not a lot happened. It wasn't there. There's not a lot of extraordinary change. The main thing is at some point there was a switch towards controlled sort of slaughtering and control over reproduction. Um, but it was a long time before you started to see, things like changes in sheep and goat for wool. It was actually probably a long time before you started to see things like dairy products and um, there. It's not a lot really known about the process other than like I sort of would suspect that there is a connection there between a broader shift towards like agriculture and folks kind of adapting to the new world of the Holocene and their relationship with plants and maybe feeding and but it's yeah, there's not too much to say. I would read Mindy's papers if you want to hear from somebody who actually knows something. The one interesting wrinkle I can add is that it does look like people moved into Central Asia with sheep and possibly goats like way, way earlier than we thought, 8,000 years ago or so. And some of our work in Kyrgyzstan showed that, they've been around in Inner Asia for, thousands and thousands of years, which again gives them a different ecological role uh, than we might typically associate with the word domestic. So. I see a question here about X-rays. So, uh, yeah, X-ray are an interesting tool for studying horse domestication. They're uh, I've worked with X-rays in particular when we have like that horse mummy I showed you. Sometimes we really do need to see through soft tissue, or sometimes they can help understand internal structure. Mostly, um, I think the main reason I've done X-rays is because I wanted a vet's opinion and they didn't know how to understand regular bone. So, they're an interesting tool. The other place that I've seen people use them a fair amount is um, like in ancient Egypt, Salima does a lot of X-rays with the mummies because they're really useful in seeing through soft tissue and they're cheaper and easier than like a CT scan. So, but
Okay, so we'll have
I'm
more
sure you all have
questions.
something more interesting to do with your day. For those of you in Europe, it's getting late, and I
Yes,
appreciate your time in listening to me talk and in um, talking with me because I think, like I said, the best part about a event like this is just um, the folks that are in attendance, and I'm quite humbled to meet some of you and to have you all listen to me, and great to see some old friends. So thank you again for the invitation, and please feel free to reach out to me if you want to correspond more or talk more about something I said.
thank you very much. We'll for agreeing to come and to talk. And we are actually thinking about yeah, doing a thematic issue for next year for Chiron, which will focus on the wild feral free living horses, so we can continue this dialogue
Cool.
different
Yeah,
way.
keep me posted.
Yeah, and our next virtual event in March, we are still figuring out the date and time, but the speaker will be Igor Chichirkov, and he will be talking about his work. So as remaining in prehistory, the idea is that Igor can talk about his like more recent project, which you embraced, I think, on the experiment, and also kind of tell about other ways you can trace this domestication, riding, driving before there were any texts, which is fascinating. So.
I'm gonna have to go to that. So a pitch for those of you who don't know Igor, that will be an amazing talk. He is probably one of the only people in the world who knows how to build a Eurasian chariot, and he's done some amazing things with. He's currently working on replicating a Sintashta bridle for our museum exhibit. So he's an expert in a number of ways, both archaeology and lived experience, and a great scholar. So I will look forward to seeing you all at the next event as an attendee of Igor's talk. That sounds great.
Well, thank you very much, and let's wrap it up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.